Hi everybody, welcome to the third unit of the Lunch and Learn series. I'm looking forward to working with you over the next hour. Just want to make sure that I'm coming through loud and clear. So if you could just type the word clear over there in the question box, that would help me to um, realise that I'm not just talking to myself, which is never a good sign. So could you just indicate if you can hear me? Just type in a message there to let me know that. Great, thanks John. Excellent, thanks David. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is fantastic. All right, so welcome to Unit 3. As I said, I hope you've had some fun with your influencing profile and had a look at an opportunity to try and improve your influence. If you haven't done the profile, of course, it's part of what you paid for in the program. So more than happy to walk you through the process. Just send me an email, and I can get you started on that fairly quickly. All right. So today we're going to look at getting the best out of. In fact, the next two modules are looking at getting the best out of people, the people that you lead, of course. So let's get underway. I'll just turn off the webcam so that I can see my screen at least. All right, so I guess I'd like to start from the assumption that if you think about your role as a leader, I think it's fair to say that your role as a leader, your primary role as a leader, is to get the very best out of each member of your team. So I'd like to work from that assumption. Now, of course, there are a whole lot of other roles that you've got, getting the product or the service out the door, making sure that you troubleshoot, um, reporting clearly to those above you, and so forth and so on. There's a whole lot of things that you're expected to do. But at the end of the day, the differential, I think, is about getting the best out of other people. And that's a pretty elusive topic. It's a difficult topic. And there's probably a couple of people that you can think of where you have tried, plan A, you've tried plan B, you've tried everything you possibly can, but nothing seems to be working. So I'm hoping that I can give you the tools to perhaps look at that a little bit differently during this hour. And of course, like everything else, I'll give you some homework to do at the conclusion of this broadcast. So I'm going to cover basically three things in this presentation today. I'm going to look at some of the barriers, excuse me, the barriers to a conversation culture. I have a very strong view that the only real way that you're going to actually get enhanced performance from other people is via the medium of conversation. You won't be able to do it via email. You won't be able to do it in team meetings. You will only be able to do it pretty much in a one-on-one forum with the other person in the room engaging in the conversation. But there are a lot of barriers, of course, that prevent that from happening. So what I want to do is look at some of those barriers. In fact, I'll look at 9 of those barriers. And then what I'm going to do is share with you a framework that I know works because I've implemented in many, many organisations across 21 industries. And it is a vehicle that you might find very useful in terms of building a conversation culture. And then towards the end of the hour, I'm going to share with you 5 more developmental conversations. So as I'm going through these frameworks, you can think for yourself, how many of these do I do? Do I do enough? How can I do them better? And so forth. So there's a range of questions that you'd probably be able to ask yourself as a result of this broadcast. But I think the first thing I'd like to do is share with you some pretty sobering statistics. And I don't know whether these statistics will surprise you, but it does set the scene for why I'm suggesting that we need to work much harder at developing the best from the people that we lead. This will come up and, yep, there we go. It's on your screen. It's disappeared. There it is. 79% of organisations worldwide struggle to engage and retain their employees. That probably doesn't surprise you. So it's a pretty frightening prospect, isn't it, to think that the majority of an organisation, maybe your organisation, are disengaged. And what that means, of course, is that you're obviously not getting the best out of those people. They may well be looking for other jobs. They may well be just passively going through the motions at work. But nevertheless, 78% is a sobering statistic. Here's another statistic that's quite interesting. 89% of organisations believe they don't have an adequate leadership pipeline to address these problems. So they're not growing leaders, in other words. And part of your role is to grow leaders, basically, and you can only do that through conversation. So if you looked around your team, for example, could you identify who your key players are? Are there people there who have leadership capabilities? What are you doing about developing them, and how could you go about doing that in a better way? Are questions that you should be asking yourself. Another question that, or another sobering statistic at least, would be this, that 90% of leaders rely on their own ideas rather than seeking the involvement of their team members. Worse still, 89% of leaders fail to listen or respond to the interpersonal cues of those they interact with. Now, we can question the methodology of those statistics, but nevertheless, I think the sentiment is true that getting people involved in teams often does take time, and because it takes time and we're all time poor, we tend to just unilaterally make decisions without consulting our team members, and this can be problematic down the track, particularly when we're talking about engaging people. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Disturbingly, only 5% of leaders are effective at building trust in their interactions with their team members. So trust is one of those elusive concepts that you can lose very quickly by one action or even just saying one thing, and you can actually take a long time to gain it. So trust is a commodity that's critically important to leadership, and obviously what the statistics are showing us is that that is in short supply. Another interesting statistic is that 60% of employees felt that, in some way at least, that their self-esteem was dented by their leaders at work. And what they're saying is that these people would rather do almost anything else than sit through a performance conversation with their boss. Although they did acknowledge that a good boss with excellent interaction skills would enhance their productivity as much as 60%. So what that basically means is that we need to be getting much better at having performance conversations, and if we do it well, the benefits are quite stark, they're quite profound, and that's coming from employees, that's coming from team members themselves. I think sometimes we confuse the idea that because people don't like something that they don't benefit from it, and I think, at the end of the day, our job is to be respected, not necessarily to be liked. Of course, we don't want to be disliked, but respect is really what we're trying to achieve here. Another statistic, 79% of employees who quit their job cite a lack of appreciation as a key reason for leaving. And I've been involved in lots of exit interviews, and exit interviews are when people leave. They'll often have a meeting, usually with HR, and they'll explain often their real reason for leaving. And the real reasons are often quite interesting. They're often to do with their lack of a working relationship with their boss. I know that's not just your responsibility, it's theirs as well, but nevertheless, I hear that a lot from across different industries. 65% of North Americans report that they didn't receive any recognition in the previous year. Now, I've a little bit dubious about that, because I think a lot of us would say that we do recognise our people, but I guess what the message out of that is that probably what we're doing is not doing enough of it. And you might recall back in Unit 1, I asked you to give some positive feedback to the people that you lead. In fact, to do it 3 times a day. I hope you're still doing that, because that's one way to turn that around significantly. But you've got to get, I guess, into the habit of doing that. So let's talk a little bit around conversations and what they mean. So just excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink of water. Okay. First key point I'd like to make, and I make this in one of my books, the book is titled Conversations at Work, and it's co-authored with Aubrey Warren. And in the book, we say that organisations are conversations. And what we mean by that is that every day, in every situation, there are hundreds, thousands, even tens or even hundreds of thousands of conversations that go on each day. These conversations occur in the boardroom, they occur in the lunchroom, they occur in the car, they occur even in the toilet. They occur everywhere. And so if you conceptualize organizations as a bunch of conversations going on regularly, you can see that it is an organization. Organizations really are conversations. So, of course, not all those conversations are productive, of course, and probably I'd suggest that 80% of those conversations are what I'd call technical-centered conversations. They're very much to do with getting the product or the service out the door. And I'm not suggesting for a minute we should stop having those conversations. Of course we should. But it's the other 20% of conversations that worry me, and those are what I would call the people-centered conversations. These are the conversations about getting the best from the people that we lead. So if you think about it, organisations are really a series of conversations, as I said. The question then is really, good quality conversation is sadly neglected. I think obviously what we've got in our technologically advanced society is that people are having conversations via email, people are having conversations via text, and what's happening is, and of course sometimes that's a really good way of having a conversation, but often what happens is that we are doing that instead of actually talking to the person face to face, either face to face or via the telephone. So we're using technology sometimes, in fact I'd say quite a lot, to have conversations that we really should be having face to face. So I think the quality of conversations is sadly neglected, and I guess we've all got to become good at that. Which brings me to the next point, that we often hear the phrase that we have the art of conversation, that there's some sort of an art form to having conversations. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's true to say that difficult performance conversations do require a certain skill set, no question. And but I think a lot of conversations are just pretty easy. And I think what we do is we hide behind this notion that it's some sort of an art form, when in fact every single one of us have spent considerable amounts of our time over our career and in our personal life having conversations. Some of them are long, some of them are short, some of them are meaningful, some of them are not, some of them meander, some of them are structured, some of them are formal, some of them are informal, some of them are done on the run, some of them are prepared. So these conversations we're all used to because we've all been part of conversations. So I'm not sure that it's an art form, and I think it's quite interesting that if your parents were alive today and you had an opportunity to go and visit them and you explain to them that tomorrow you're in a training course all day to learn how to have conversations, I think they'd be quite amused. I think they'd be very amused. So we've kind of lost sight of the fact that we have regular conversations every day in lots of different ways. So I'm not sure there's necessarily an art form to it. Another key point coming up on your screen now is that I'd ask the question, have we lost the need for conversations? I would suggest the answer to that is no. I think it's a very human thing to do, and I think it's a very important thing to do. I think what's happening is that we have started, as I said before, to use technology to have conversations that we really should be having face to face, or at least on the phone, or at least via some sort of a video uh, conferencing technology. So I don't think we've lost the need. I think the need will always be there. It's a question, of course, of how we do it. I remember talking to a manager last week, and I was talking about these very points, and he was the business owner, and he said to me that he didn't think that his business was ready to have conversations, which was a rather amusing comment to me, because I thought, well, when will you be ready? And when you say ready, what do you mean by ready? We're having, as I said before, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of conversations every day. This is just more of the same. It's just that we perhaps make them a little bit more skillful, a little bit more of a quality conversation. So I thought, there's a lot of people that will say, and I think the underlying assumption of what he was really saying was, look, I'm not sure that we've got time for conversations. In other words, digging a bit further, he's probably saying, well, I'm not sure that there's value in having conversations. Well, of course there is, but it's the quality of the conversations that's critically important. Another key point is that two of my favourite authors and colleagues of mine from the United States, Jim Kersner and Barry Posner, who've written a great book called Credibility. If you ever want to get a good book on building up trust and credibility, I'd strongly recommend that you look at that book. But in that book, early on in the book, they make the claim that leadership is a relationship. And I think that's a brilliant observation, that leadership is a relationship. In other words, if you don't have a working relationship with the people that you lead, it's very hard to actually lead them. But my question to Kersner and Posner is this: how do you have a relationship? And the answer to that, of course, is one conversation at a time. That's the answer to that. So I think that you can't avoid having conversations with the people that you lead if you are in the business of building a robust working relationship up with them. So really, we can't avoid this whole idea of having conversations. And the conversations that I'm really referring to here in Unit 3 are performance conversations and conversations on people's development. In a nutshell, I'm talking about people-centered conversations. So you can guess what your homework's going to be. It'll be about having or bumping up the frequency of your people-centered conversations. So there's a little bit of an overview about conversations generally. As I always ask, if you've got any questions, any comments, any statements, please just type them in the question box there, and I'll stop the presentation and answer those, because I'd rather make this as interactive as I probably can. So I've probably put a lot of thought-provoking information out there that people might want to comment on, and I'm happy to take those comments as we go. While you're thinking about that, we'll move on. So what I want to do now is to look at the 9 common barriers to having conversations. And you might say, why 9? Well, I'm sure there are many more, but these 9 are 9 that are very typical. You'll recognize them. You may even do them yourself. They're a combination of personal barriers, emotional barriers, and physical barriers. So we'll have a look at those, and you might, as I go through these, think about these barriers in terms of your own behaviour as a leader, and what you're doing in this space. These aren't necessarily in any order, so I'm not suggesting that the first barrier that I'm going to put up in a moment is actually the number one barrier. They're all critically important, and they're all important to try to minimize or even better eliminate. So, barrier one, come up on your screen very soon, hopefully. Okay. Barrier one is our inattention during conversations. I think we've been taught to multitask. You know, there's a lot of, because we're all time poor, we think that we could probably do two things at once. So the typical situation is that somebody is at your door, if you've got an office, and they want to see you urgently about a matter, and you're frantically tapping out an email, and it's an important email, and you think to yourself as you see so-and-so at the doorway, I can do both things here. I can listen and I can type. So you actually say to the person at the door, go ahead, I've just got to get this email out. It's very important, but I am listening. And of course, you're tapping away and listening at the same time, or at least trying to. So the very first thing about that is I can guarantee to you that the quality of the email is not going to be anywhere near as good as it could be. And secondly, the quality of your conversation with the person at the doorway is nowhere near going to be as good as it could be. So by trying to do two things at once, you're actually not doing justice to either of those two activities. So when you're in those positions, obviously, if it is a very critical email, then let the person know by all means and just say to them, look, I can't stop at the moment. I've got to finish this email. As soon as I've finished this email, I'll come over and have a chat to you. All right? And then, of course, finish the email and then by all means do what you promised to do and go and talk to the person about what they want to talk about. The other option, of course, is if you think it's quite important what the person is wanting to talk to you about, then shut down your screen, ask them to take a seat and give them undivided attention. That would be the way forward with that. So, and of course, the latest research in this area demonstrates that we aren't good at multitasking. Of course, we have all these jokes about women are better at multitasking than men, but the reality is our brain's not geared to be doing two things at once. We can do them, of course, but we don't do justice to either of those activities. So you're better off just stopping doing one and give your full attention to the other, if that makes sense, even though it's very tempting to try to do both. Barrier number two, which will come up on your screen very shortly. Barrier number two is this idea of having restricted information channels at work. In other words, we often use phrases like, you'll be told on a need-to-know basis, or no news is good news. In other words, we restrict the information flow to the people we lead for a couple of obvious reasons. One is that we feel that the information that we want to share with our team members is quite sensitive, and we're worried that it may leak out to the union or to the media or somewhere. And the other reason is that we think, well, we don't want to bombard them with that. They don't want to know about that. So we decide not to tell them. This is a very serious issue and one that is affecting all of us. I've very rarely seen an organisation where team members have pretty much in an aggregate format said that they're very happy with the quality of information they're receiving from their boss. So what we've got to do is open up our information channels and share information. Now, of course, it may be risky to do that, and it may well be that people do run off to the local newspaper, or they may well run off to the union. But I can guarantee they're going to be mischievous anyway. Sometimes it's worth just taking the risk. Of course, there is information that shouldn't be shared and very sensitive information, but I think the rule of thumb is if you're in doubt, share it. That's probably a good rule of thumb. But I think it's important for you to share information because essentially what you want to do is give the person the same perspective that you have. And obviously, if they have the same perspective that you have, it'll be far easier for them to come to the same conclusions that you do about a particular topic. Of course, the disturbing assumption about restricted information channels is that we don't trust employees. And that's quite disturbing. And of course, it's not lost on employees either. They understand that they think that the reason that you're not sharing this information is that you don't trust them, which of course isn't a very good starting point if we're trying to build up trust with our team members and colleagues. So that can be a serious barrier for us to have meaningful conversations in the workplace. So share more information, do it in team meetings, of course, but also one-on-one, because people will benefit from that. And if they abuse that opportunity, then okay, you can have another conversation with them about that. But at the end of the day, if you're not sharing information because you're worried that they might leak that information, then I think it's the wrong reason not to be sharing information. Another barrier, barrier number 3, is a barrier around a lack of feedback. Australian managers are the world's worst at giving feedback, at least that's what the surveys are showing, and that's quite disturbing. And I mean, we can all have our own theories as to why that might be the case, but I guess at the end of the day, if you're not giving people good, practical, timely, detailed information about their performance, then it's problematic. And you know, I've talked about this in Unit 2, and I'll keep talking about it through all of the units, that it's really important to give people feedback. Now, of course, there's 2 types of feedback. There's positive feedback and there's negative feedback. I think sometimes we balk at giving negative feedback because we're worried about how the person might react. But I think the truth is we don't give enough positive feedback either. On the question of negative feedback, I think it's important to go into these situations, you know, let the other person decide how they'll react to the feedback. That's their decision. That's their choice. How they react to the feedback that you're going to give them is pretty much their choice. So don't deny them that. Your job is to do this in the most tactful and specific and situation-focused way. And if you do that, you'll probably get a better result than you probably think. Another barrier is that we've all been trained to, if you've got a trade or you've got a university qualification, it's true that you've been taught to answer questions. So, you know, somebody throws a dilemma at you and you're able to answer the question. So when I suggest that leaders should be asking questions, it becomes very difficult. It sounds very simple on the surface, but to actually ask questions is really the leadership's role, a leader's role. The questions that you ask are open-ended. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. And these questions, of course, open up a conversation. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which will give more than a one-word answer. So, you know, it means that the other person's got to elaborate beyond a yes or no. And if you're really interested in having good conversations with the people that you lead, then my suggestion to you is to learn how to have or learn to ask good questions. So, for example, if somebody comes to you with a dilemma that's quite complex and you're worried that by asking a lot of questions you might appear a little bit ignorant, or you might feel as if you're some sort of a detective asking a bunch of questions, then my suggestion is a good way to start that conversation is actually to say to the other person, look, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions so that I can get to understand the situation better? By doing that, of course, you're asking a question. And, of course, the person's likely to say, no problem, or go for your life. And then you can feel comfortable asking a series of questions, probing questions, which will give you an opportunity to get to the bottom of whatever it is that they want to talk to you about. So that can be a real barrier. Barrier number 5 is sometimes we conduct these conversations in our office. I don't think it's necessarily the best place to conduct conversations. The reason I say that is, of course, it's your territory. And what it means is that the other person perhaps feels a little less comfortable than they would be in a neutral environment. Some of the best conversations, believe it or not, I think some of you would know this anyway because you've done it, happen in coffee shops. So getting away from the office and being able to discuss an issue or a performance matter or a developmental matter is a very effective way of going about things. So try not to conduct too many conversations in your office. Of course you feel comfortable doing that, but that's not the point. You want the other person to feel comfortable talking to you, and I can assure you they'll feel less comfortable because it's your territory. So try and get out and about if you can. If you're in an open office environment, then of course you need to find a room somewhere where you can sit down and close the door and have the conversation with the other person. Barrier number 6. Barrier number 6, of course, I had to get to it at some time. It'll come up on your screen now. Barrier number 6 is our over-reliance on emails. And as I said at the outset, we often spend time having conversations via email when really a far more effective way would be to get on the phone or, if possible, go and see the person and have a talk to them face to face. Ironically, you'll get things done quicker, you'll get a better understanding of where they're coming from, and of course you'll get better buy-in as well because it's personalised. The average person spends 2.5 hours a day on email. So have a think about where you stand with that. 2.5 hours a day we communicate via email. And I'm certainly not a Luddite, and I'm certainly not against email. I think it's a wonderful tool and I use it regularly, as you know. But sometimes what happens is that we use it instead of having conversations. So look, it's really important sometimes to think before you put your fingers to your keyboard is to think, would I be better off discussing this face to face or over the phone with Joe or Mary rather than to send them this long-winded email which will be buried amongst the 200 other emails that they get for the day. So I think this is a barrier. Email communication is asynchronous, which basically means this, that when you send an email, the person will respond to your email at a time of their choosing, perhaps not at a time that's convenient to you. So of course these days it'll take 2 or 3 days for us to answer emails, where perhaps even as little as a year or 2 years ago we could probably respond to an email request within 24 hours. It's very difficult now. And that's because we're sharing lots of information via this medium that we probably should be doing face to face or at least on the telephone. Barrier number 7. Barrier number 7 is to do with leadership, and that is that if you, in your office or in your organisation, if your leaders aren't modelling good conversation, it's highly likely that promoting good conversation throughout your organisation is not going to happen. So I'd strongly urge you to have a look around the office, and if you are in a senior role, and I know some of you are, then if you're not modelling the way on this, I can assure you that other people won't either. So it's important that to create a culture of conversation, that everybody is involved in this process, from the CEO through to the janitor. And I often find that we try and promote a culture of conversation, but we don't actually realise that it starts at the top, like all things in organisational change. So that becomes critically important. Okay, conversation number 8. Oh, sorry, conversation number 8. I meant barrier number 8. Sometimes we don't raise things because we're afraid of opening a can of worms. In other words, let sleeping dogs lie. And we think that hopefully the behaviour will go away, or the situation will improve miraculously, so we don't bother to confront the person about their particular behaviour. And of course, as we all know, if we're honest, that behaviour never changes. In fact, sometimes it gets worse. And the reason for that is that the person's got no feedback whatsoever from you or me, so they just assume that what they're doing is perfectly appropriate. I had a situation where I was working in an orchestra, and the principal, who's the head of their section, was telling me a story where one of their musicians used to arrive late habitually to rehearsals. And in an orchestra, that's a shocking thing to do, because obviously you want everybody ready to go. So when the conductor's ready to go, you want everyone there ready to go. And I suggested to that principal that they needed to sit down and talk about that with that particular musician. And they came back and I said, what happened? And they said, well, they were surprised. I said, why were they surprised? I said, well, they'd never received that feedback before, so they just assumed that it was okay or acceptable to be 5 or 10 minutes late for each particular rehearsal, which of course it isn't. So they worked on the assumption that it was fine because they hadn't heard anything from their team leader. So please, talk about things, open up conversations. It is important to do that. And you'll find that they often go better than you probably envisage. At the end of the day, it's up to the other person, as I said before, to decide how they might react to that conversation. And barrier number 9. Now, there's not much you can do about this in your own office, but the office layout can be a barrier as well. We've moved towards open office plans for good reason since the 1980s, because what we are attempting to do by having an open office plan is to encourage more frequent communication. And that, of course, does happen. But of course, what also happens is that the quality of those conversations are fairly superficial, because of course we know that other people are listening in, so we don't often broach subjects that we should. So of course, by the time we organise a room and so forth, it's not worth it. So what we tend to do is not talk about the things that really need to be done or need to be talked about in an open office environment. So it's a difficult issue, but one that's critically important. There is no right office layout, incidentally, for offices. And the other thing is, I often hear managers say to me, oh, I have an open door policy. So people can come in anytime they want. And I feel like saying to them, yes, it's great that you've got an open door policy, but do you have an open mind policy? Because that's a difference there. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the view that you should have your door open all the time. I think there are times when it's quite practical for you to close the door when you've got a report or something that you've got to get done, a tender or whatever it might be. So I think people are quite accepting of that, and it's important, of course, at times to have an open door policy, but not all the time, because otherwise you won't get anything else done, which is critically important to your success in your position. So guys, that's the 9 barriers, and I hope you've had a chance to think about those barriers and which of them perhaps you're guilty of. I think we're all guilty of some of those things some of the time, but of course I just want to sensitize you to some of the things that get in the way of having good quality conversations. Now, what I'm sharing with you and what you can see on your screen now is the 5 conversations framework. Now, this is a framework that you can use to start having better quality conversations with your colleagues, your team members. And I'm just going to run through it very briefly with you, but if you want more information about it, I'm more than happy to talk to you at another time. So just send me an email. But you'll notice that over on the left-hand side, you've got 5 months. And I'm suggesting that to get into the swing of these developmental conversations, the idea is to have one short conversation a month. When I say short, I'm talking 10-15 minutes. And some people are very skeptical about that and say, how can you possibly have a good conversation in 10 to 15 minutes? Very easily. In fact, I've been involved in some 2-hour conversations that aren't terribly productive. So the time is not the issue, but this framework is set up to be having short conversations with each team member once a month. So you'll notice in the second column the topic of the conversation. So we've got climate review, strengths and talents, opportunities for growth, learning and development, and innovation and continuous improvement. So there's a bit of a methodology here as to why I have them in this order. So let me just briefly run through those, and you can see there's a bit of content there, and there's a couple of key questions that you could ask. You'll be getting a copy of these slides, of course, at the end of the presentation, so don't panic, and you'll also get a video recording as usual. So in month one, you can start off with having a climate review. A climate review is really essentially about people's job satisfaction, the morale they have around the office, and the communication patterns and channels. So we spend hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars a year doing engagement surveys online, and of course people are very skeptical about that, and we find that what's happening is that people are getting less and less participation rates on those surveys. One is because people are genuinely busy, but a more important reason is that they don't believe that anything's necessarily going to change. So why should I bother giving frank and fearless feedback when in fact nothing will happen with the feedback? So why not have a conversation about this with people? So the first question here, it's not there on the screen, but the first question to ask is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 is high, 1 is low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? It's a great question to ask, and the person then is prompted to give you a number, so they might say 6. And then of course the next question is why? So why 6? And then of course you listen to what they have to say. It's far less confronting than how's your job satisfaction at the moment, and they say good, and then of course nothing else happens. Then the third question might be around, well, if it's a 6, is there anything that I can do perhaps to get it to a 7 or an 8 that's not currently happening? All right. And then the next question around that could be, now there's a couple of things that I perhaps need you to do that might be helpful to be able to help us in this area. So it's an easy conversation to have. It's a generalized conversation. It does raise a number of interesting issues. And then once we've done that, we move on to conversation 2 in month 2, which is based on people's strengths and talents. The argument is that people generally have innate talents, and what happens is that when they come to the workplace, we've been socialized into trying to overcome our weaknesses, and of course what we do is we avoid our strengths. But we've all got these innate talents, and why not have a conversation to talk about people's strengths and how those strengths can be better utilized in their current and perhaps future roles in the organization. That's a far more affirming conversation than to start going straight for the jugular and talking about weaknesses. So talk about people's strengths. So for example, if somebody is very good at dealing with customers and yet they spend the majority of their day staring at a computer screen, is there anything that you could possibly do, recognizing that they are good with customers, to perhaps give them more customer interface? Is there any way that you can maneuver, roles and responsibilities in order to take advantage of their talent in that area? So that's the nature of the conversation. Conversation 3, of course, is about the other side, and these are excuse me, opportunities for growth. And of course, there are things that we've all got to work on. There are things we've all got to achieve in our workplace. Well, why not have a conversation about that? But I would say to you that I would be asking your team members to come to these 5 conversations having already thought about them. So in other words, preempted. That way you're going to get something meaningful coming back to you, and not people sitting there and saying to you, oh, I haven't really thought about it. What we want people to do is to actually come to these conversations having given this some consideration, so that it makes some sense to the conversation and adds some value, if you like. Conversation 4, now you can imagine out of conversation 2 and 3, you're likely to get a whole lot of interesting information. And conversation 4 is really around learning and development. There's probably going to be a whole host of support and growth measures that can be taken in order to capitalize on people's strengths and perhaps help minimize areas of weakness in conversation 3. So this is not about sending people off to courses. This is really, a lot of it is actually coaching in the workplace. It's actually probably informal. It's about showing people how things can work, or giving people some mentoring, or whatever it might be. So conversation 4 is around strengths and talents, learning and development. Conversation 5 is around innovation and continuous improvement. So conversation 4 is about them and their growth, whereas conversation 5 is about their workplace and its efficiency and effectiveness. So asking people to come to a conversation having thought about some key ideas and ways of being able to make things go faster, easier, with greater quality, with reduced costs. There's a whole host of possibilities there. But one of the reasons that we find that people are reluctant to volunteer their ideas at work, if you like, is because people don't think that it's terribly important, or that the manager's not going to really listen to what they have to say. So it's really important to have a regular conversation about innovation and continuous improvement. And that's pretty exciting if you think about an organisation where everybody across the whole organisation has a conversation about innovation and continuous improvement during, say, the month of August. There will be a number of good ideas that will come out of that, that'll be fairly easy to implement, probably not cost the earth, and will get considerable buy-in. And those then can be implemented, morale will go up, and of course the next time you have that conversation, you're likely to get more information and more ideas from the persons that work for you. So that framework I'd highly recommend to you. I think it works extremely well. I know it works very well. We've implemented this across a number of different industries right across the world. So there are companies, would you believe, in Iceland that are implementing the 5 conversations. There are companies in the States. There are companies in Asia. It's happening in lots of places all over the world. It's a great framework to start to have developmental and performance conversations with your people. Some people will often ask me and say, well, what about the hard conversation around performance? Well, that's a separate conversation, and you should be having that. But at the end of the day, these conversations are quite powerful and work really, really well. Okay, moving right along. There are 5 more conversations that I think you might like to consider. And the question that I have for you as I run through these 5 conversations, or 5 more developmental conversations, is, are you having enough of these conversations in your workplace? So let's have a look at them. The first conversation that you should be having on a regular basis, of course, is your coaching conversation. And you might say, well, surely coaching's one way. Wouldn't it be me just sitting down and explaining how things are done? Well, to a point, but at the end of the day, you want those people, that's the coachee, engaged in the conversation. Of course, there's lots and lots of courses now out there on the leader being the coach, and I think it's very much in vogue at the moment. But I think coaching is a conversation. In other words, you engage with the other person pretty much in the conversation itself, in terms of brainstorming how you might go about doing something, what needs to happen, what barriers in the way, what delegated authority does the person have, and so forth. Now, obviously, these would be on reasonably complex projects. You wouldn't, for example, have a coaching conversation if you wanted someone to go off and, photocopy something. That's obviously a different sort of scenario. But where you've got a developmental opportunity with somebody, have a coaching conversation with them. Another type of conversation that many of you would be very adept in is the mentoring conversation. So mentoring and coaching, you might say, what's the difference? Well, coaching's more a technical focus, whereas mentoring is more a career focus. So you might find that people rely on you as their mentor. If you have been fortunate enough, as I have, in your career to have had a great mentor, you will know that it makes a profound difference. So don't be discouraged from being a good mentor. It's extremely important to do that. Have a delegation conversation. So a delegation conversation, of course, again, like a coaching conversation, shouldn't be one way. It should be about brainstorming with the person about how they might go about something that's a little bit more complicated than just going off and doing something. So delegation, of course, most of us will be criticised for not delegating enough. That's certainly a conversation that you can have with people. The visioning conversation, well, I don't think we have anywhere near enough of these conversations. These conversations are about the why of work. So that's what Dave Ulrich talks about when he talks about the why of work. And Simon Sinek, of course, has made his name on this whole idea of explaining to people the why of what they do. So do you spend enough time with people explaining the rationale of why you want something done a certain way, or what the implications of doing something the right or indeed the wrong way are? Do people know the rationale? Very simple example. You've got a production area and you at the end of the shift you actually instruct somebody to sweep the production area. You've never asked them to do that before, and clearly they don't look too enthusiastic about it because they want to get home to their family after a long shift. But if you explain to them that the reason that you want them to do that is that you've got a customer coming in early the next morning who is seriously considering moving their stock from one of your competitors to their company, and they want to have a good look around the production area and are interested in checking it out. And you comment to the person that you've asked to sweep the floor that by doing that you're helping to create the right impression. Now, they're not going to be jumping up and down with great excitement wanting to sweep the floor, but at least they understand the reason for it. So be prepared to have that conversation. The encouraging conversation, most of us in this broadcast today are self-starters. We've got to where we have in our careers because we, are sufficiently robust. But don't assume that everyone's like that. People need to be encouraged. And just saying to people, thank you, or I really appreciate what you did when you spoke to that customer who I know is difficult, thank you, it can go a long way. Don't underestimate the power of having the encouraging conversation. And in fact, I'd strongly recommend that you weave that into your repertoire. Some people think, oh my goodness, people will go all soft if I start encouraging people. No, they won't. They won't. In fact, they'll feel very good and feel very encouraged if you're willing to recognise and encourage and support them at different junctures. Okay, two key things before we finish up. The trick for you in conversations is to move from first to second to third position. What does that mean? First position means that you only see things through your own eyes. Second position is that you can see things from the other person's point of view, which is a superior position. And third position is not only can you see things from the other person's point of view, you can also get a global perspective. In other words, you've got a big picture perspective of what's going on. So you need, of course, to be in third position if you are going to have constructive performance and developmental conversations. So I'd encourage you to get into that third space. If you see two people having an argument in your workplace this afternoon, it's highly likely that they're in first position. In other words, they're defending their point of view, can only see things from their own point of view. The trick is, of course, to try to get both parties to understand the other person's point of view and then to understand the big picture of the proposal or what it is that you're trying to suggest. So third position is superior. I've already talked about this, but it's really important for you to learn to ask good questions. Asking good questions is critically important in having a good conversation. And if you do that, you will find that you will have far richer conversations and far more meaningful conversations. And remember, the purpose of this whole unit is to get the best from your team. This is about optimizing team performance. So you can have team conversations as well. But it's all about you asking really thought-provoking questions. So that's pretty much it. If you've got any questions, we've got a few minutes left, type them in. I've covered 9 barriers of the conversation culture. I've talked about a framework called the 5 Conversations Framework, and I've talked about another framework called 5 More Conversations. So I've just got a question here from Jenny. Jenny's asking about the 5 conversations, about whether in fact these conversations can last for 10 minutes or can they go for longer. Well, Jenny, thank you for the question. It really depends on what you're talking about and whether you see any value in that. Sometimes it's worth spending longer talking with people about something for a whole host of reasons, and I think you should be the judge of that. So the question about how long a conversation should go is really up to you. But the whole 5 Conversations framework is designed to ensure that the conversations last no more than 15 minutes. But if you decide that you need to talk with your person for longer than that, then I would say to you, go for your life. But if you feel that you're wasting your time, then be assertive and just say, look, I think we've finished. Is there anything else? And then just finish up your conversation there. So thanks for your question. I hope that helps. But it's not so much the length of time you have on a conversation that's important. Rather, it's the quality of the conversation that is critically important. So thanks for the question, Jenny. Just looking to see if there's any others before we wrap up. See, you're a very quiet bunch today. Either that means I'm doing a really good job or you've all fallen asleep. So I don't know which it is, but I hope it's the former rather than the latter. So guys, that looks like it might be about it. I just suggest to you that your homework is, as you can imagine, is to organise regular get-togethers with your direct reports on a fortnightly basis and stick to it no matter what and have these conversations. You don't have to do all the conversations. I've covered 10 today, but you can start to have some of those conversations and you will be amazed at what a difference it will make. But you know, there's only one way to do that, of course, and that is to get in there and do it. Thank you, David. That's lovely feedback. Yes, it's a good job. Yeah, thank you. So look, that's your homework, and I'd suggest you get in there and do that. So understand now we're up to module 4. We have got, I'll be talking to you about getting the best out of people. Then we'll talk about understanding people and their personalities in module 5. And then finally around how to facilitate more effective meetings. As always, I'm very open via email for you to ask me questions. You can, of course, ring me up as well. But if you want to clarify things or give me any feedback, please do so. I'm very open to that. So thanks, guys, and I've enjoyed working with you again, and I look forward to seeing you, seeing metaphorically, of course, seeing you on the, let's see, the 25th of August. So all the best, and I want to see some war story. I want to hear some war stories around having good quality conversations with your people. And I think if you do that, you'll be absolutely amazed at the difference it makes in terms of your workplace. So thanks, guys. I wish you all the best and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.